Unmuted.
So, welcome everyone. My name is Rick Dunn. I'm the Executive Director of the Dunn Council of Governments. We're here to present the final public session on a report that we published regional wastewater treatment in the Norfolk Valley region. A little housekeeping that we're going to go through this. There are people who are here in the room. There are people who are logged into this webinar, and they can enter questions into the chat box. Take questions from people also here in the room. But there are other people, probably a larger number of people on YouTube, who can't be interacting with us. So watching. I will tell you that we started this as a result of discussions that began between the cities of Ansonia and Derby in about 2014. Ansonia had updated their plan. Derby was in pretty good mess, still is. And there were talks of consolidation that began at that point. So NVCOG, for those of you who don't know what we do, we are an association of the 19 towns in our region who we work for. Part of our charge is to find efficiencies in delivery of regional services. We do all kinds of other things, but we also do this. So in 2017, we applied for a grant to study the regional wastewater consolidation. What do you tell me? Just tell me, Richard.
Get louder.
What?
Louder.
You need me to be louder. So in 2017, we applied for a grant for a study along the Naugatuck River, covering the towns of Naugatuck down to Derby, Falls, and so on and so on. We had originally ruled out water and shelter before we got started. OPM granted money to us, and NVCOG engaged Black and Veatch to conduct an engineering assessment and to develop feasible regional alternatives. We also engaged the Collins Center at UMass Boston. Their job is to do a deeper financial analysis and look at governing models for any regional system. The truth is we can't answer all of the questions that most of you will have about how does this affect my region. That's not what we did in this study. We looked at systems today, moving individually forward versus consolidating the system and operating it as one. So we're proud of the work in this report. There's significant savings identified to be shared among the towns, but the real work that will need to take place is after tonight by the cities. If they choose to pick this up, they're going to need to get together. They're going to need to take a look at you'll see roughly $65 million in net savings by consolidating the systems and operating them over the next 20 years. That's what savings is projected. But cities will have to get together and decide how to sort of divvy up those spoils so that all users benefit. I encourage everyone not to look at this as Derby, Ansonia, and Seymour. Try to think about it as a group of users amongst all those towns in the future. Also, keep in mind, when you see the benefits in the study, benefits are going to accrue kind of in inverse proportion to the current condition of the town facilities. So Ansonia is going to look like it's going to have a smaller benefit based upon relative benefit of the system once it's combined. And that's because Ansonia spent more money. They were more diligent about maintaining their plant and their system. Derby is going to look like it's going to have a huge benefit because Derby has invested. It's making that equation work amongst the three towns and giving up those savings and figuring out how the savings can be extended to all users in the system fairly. That's the trick to this, and that'll come after the public system report if the towns decide to pick up and move forward. So I'm going to stop talking for 5 minutes. Good, done. What I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce Mario Francochi from Black and Beach, who's going to make a presentation on the engineering report with Will Walk. And Mario?
Thanks, Rick. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for showing up tonight. So we'll prepare and we'll present to you some of the things that are pertinent the consolidation study that we undertake. And so, just to kind of give you a little bit of a roadmap on what we're going to talk about tonight is just review why you consider regionalization. It's a good question that people have in mind. We'll review the timeline activities, some of the things that Rick has already spoken about. Our study is broken down into two major phases, phase 1 and phase 2. So we'll talk about what we did in phase 1, what we did in phase 2, how those things came together into the final result. Okay, so why regionalize? It's been a well-known fact for a long time, not only here in Connecticut, but throughout the country, that the cost of upgrading wastewater infrastructure is very expensive. And that is particularly the case for small communities, relatively small communities like you folks represent here, Seymour, Ansonia. So in a way, what regionalization does is it tries to get at that problem, get at the problem of making things more affordable. And one definition of regionalization that's specifically focused to utilities is here. I'll read it. It's basically the aggregation of utilities to realize economies of scale by providing services to a larger customer base at a lower cost, increased efficiency, greater environmental benefit. That's a pretty significant order. We did not know the answer to this project when we started it off. So that was a significant driver for undertaking this work. So I won't go through a lot of this right now, because Rick already opened it up by saying that OPM, the grantor, state agency that was the grantor, provided the funds, essentially approved the study of wastewater utility consolidations for 5 communities in the Consonant Valley, going from south to north. We have Derby, Ansonia, Seymour, Beacon Falls, and Naugatuck that were all originally in study. Phase 1, we began that work in April of 2018. We finished about a year later in February. There were a number of work products that were produced. We'll get into those. We looked at growth in the system. One of the things that OPM mandated right from the beginning is that you don't want to just look at the present moment. This is a planning study. We have a 20-year horizon, and that's pretty typical of all things that look at today. Look at a period of time, a reasonable, measurable period of time in the future. Not too far in the future, but it doesn't look just at today. It looks at that entire 20-year period. And then that's an important concept. We also did condition assessment work. We developed on existing facilities, because that's our starting point. We also took a look and developed or identified a long list of alternatives, or a long list of regional alternatives that we're going to take. In phase 2, we went to phase 2 a year later, started back in March of 2020. We're home through today, and beyond today, much longer. But we developed a short list. We took all that long list of regional alternatives, we shrunk that down. We then, after that, we developed the recommended alternatives. And again, even through that point, we did not get the answer that we know today as to how this study should go. And then what we did again was we developed that recommendation further. And we did that in a number of I guess, stakeholder workshops and meetings where a lot of folks participated in. So it's been ongoing for a couple of years plus. So, okay, so let's discuss phase one. Again, I noted before that we're looking at approximately 20 years into the future, looking at the growth of these facilities, looking at the growth of the towns. We look at the State Medical Center. We provide population projections. We came and we visited with your community leaders as well, people who provide us the information to see how what development plans were on the books or plans here. So we then undertook condition assessment work at the facilities, at the wastewater treatment plants, the pumping stations that pump the flow to the pumps to the plant. We then identified those regional alternatives that we dissected and studied throughout the course of this work, and we did that in a public setting. So let's kind of review some of the things that we started off and learned as part of the initial findings. I call this the base case. Base case is essentially each community staying alone, as you're presently doing right now. You're staying alone, taking care of your own wastewater service, and managing facilities, paying bills. Base case is obviously regionalization is combining communities to do that with the aspirations that are identified before. So, okay, so the third wastewater treatment plant, it last saw it as a major upgrade in the early 1970s, 1972. That's a long time, folks. That's a long time for wastewater service. So overall condition, I think you don't need me with any paying water protection, which I believe is why it's asked. Overall condition of the facility is that it's poor. It's overdue for a major overhaul. Virtually every facility at the plant needs to be upgraded or replaced. Some safety issues have been noted, and some of those are already underway. And even deep Department of Energy and Environmental Protection, in its consent order in the city of 2015, identified that modernization of the entire treatment facility is required, either that or redirect wastewater flow to another facility. Just a very few photographs of what the facility looks like. We are showing photographs of the pumping station, the pumping station, screening facility, and grid and removal systems. All of these systems need to be replaced in their entirety or undergo a significant upgrade. And we're going to shift gears just a little bit, just talk about the collection systems. That's the pipe systems, the buried pipes that carry the wastewater to the treatment plant for treatment. And we have a very old collection system. I'd say about 70% or more of the pipe work is what we call vitrified clay pipe. These are very short segments of pipe, very old technology, very leaky joints. It's not uncommon that many of the pipes in this community is on the order of 50 to 100 years old. And that's starting to reach the end of its usefulness. That's particularly the case when there's been deferred maintenance to that. Much money has been spent on the collection system. Now, over the past 5 years, there has been a definite uptick in and upkeep and improvement to that collection system. However, 5 years, you still got a long way to go to get to where you have a good, healthy, and reliable collection system. I noted here that there's a system that is a leaky system. Why is that important? Because you get during the late storms in particular, but also when groundwater is high, those leaky joints that I mentioned in the pipe basically infiltrate water coming into the pipes along with the sewage, and that just exacerbates pumping. It puts extraordinary strain on treatment facilities and paying for not only not having a good, reliable piping system, but you're paying for the downstream as well. Pumping. Okay, perfect. I think that's better. Okay, next slide. Okay, we'll talk about the Ansonia plant as well. Rick noted the plant underwent a significant upgrade in 2011. And that's very good. Overall condition of the plant would be rated satisfactory. There's still at least one hydraulic restriction at the plant that needs to be taken care of because it exacerbates the ability for that plant to handle flow during high flows that are experienced during wet weather conditions when it rains. Sludge processing is also not efficient. Because it's not efficient, you're paying money to get rid of that sludge and process it elsewhere. So we recommend an upgrade there. There's several systems that are also lacking redundancy. But the key point is, while those deficiencies do exist, the plant, you can't compare the Ansonia plant. The Ansonia plant is satisfactory. So, the collection system in Ansonia pretty much mimics what I said for Durham. It's an old system, it's an off-water, vitrified coal pipe in the system, and basically what we identified for Derby, Ansonia, and even Seymour, we recommended that a 5-year catch-up period on an accelerated plan to upgrade the system, the collection system, and then basically take care of it on a year-on basis for thereafter. The Seymour plant was built in the 1970s, with the most recent upgrade in early 1990s. Overall condition, we would rate it efficient, not nearly as bad as the Derby, but definitely needs attention at this time. And we've identified some of these systems that are required for significant upgrade or replacement at that plant. Here at the slide, headworks, the infant pump station is an upgrade, primary clarification, and so forth. These are systems within the treatment plant. And I think the most important takeaway that I would also like to leave you with is that wastewater is a severe duty environment for equipment, certainly also for personnel, but certainly for equipment, severe duty equipment just does not last long. If you're wondering, am my staff been negligent, and is that why it's old? That's not the reason it's old. It needs to be replaced. And as we see these type of grading systems from us, it's because it is a severe duty. But I do want to say about our staff is it is an amazing staff. We met with them. They essentially walked the facilities with us, peered under manholes, peered under grading, so that we were able to look at these facilities, and they've done everything they could to let us understand the facilities and a lot of credit goes for them, and even more credit goes for them to keep these facilities running. Next slide. Okay, so these are some of the things, some of the systems at Seymour that we highlighted here. You see equipment here that's either in deteriorated condition or that has reached the end of its useful life. That's what equipment is. It's mechanical equipment, just like in automobiles. After a while, they wear out. What we're saying in a nutshell is that these facilities are worn out and need to be upgraded. Okay, the collection system at Seymour, again, it's a little newer and there's less of that vitrified clay pipe than there is at Derby and Ansonia. However, there's been a lot of deferred maintenance on the Seymour collection system as well. So we've programmed, at least we recommended an accelerated program of renewal be undertaken for the Seymour collection system, and then a moderate for 5 years, and then a moderate program thereafter. Slide. Okay, so on this slide, what we're trying to do is I'm trying to take all the slides that I just showed you on the plants and the collection system. We've used the dashboard display of green, yellow, and red lights to indicate kind of the end result in terms of condition at Seymour. We're saying essentially efficient condition of the plant and also the collection systems. In fact, the collection system for Consonant and Derby are also efficient. Obviously, and Consonant treatment plant satisfactory, and the treatment plant of Consonant is important. Like Rick said, we had Naugatuck and Beacon Falls in the study. We dropped them out after phase 2 got started. Also, things as to why before we rated their systems. Okay, so regional alternatives. So far, we're talking about the base case, and we're talking about your facilities. Let's talk about regional alternatives. So we've got 4 diagrams. I'm just going to ask you maybe to focus on the diagram way over to the left. That's called the base case, which is exactly what we have right now. 5 communities handling business on their own, full-time, every day. What is regionalization? What we started doing is we started developing connections. It's conduit, it's pipe that's going to go, for instance, on the second diagram. We have an arrow going from Beacon Falls to Seymour, an arrow going from Seymour to Ansonia, an arrow going from Derby to Ansonia. And those are pipelines that connect those communities ultimately down to Ansonia. Now, what we're doing is one of the things we're trying to do is we're trying to develop synergies with regionalization. So what we're doing is we would be eliminating, the idea would be to eliminate the treatment plants at Beacon Falls, at Seymour, and Derby, and bring that flow to Ansonia. That way, the capital gets shared more, and we don't have 4 plants to maintain and operate each other. And we looked at every possible combination that truly made sense, in regionalization. I'll tell you one that didn't make sense. For instance, Beacon Falls. I think everybody knows Beacon Falls is a very small town. It's Wastewater, which is also small. We're not going to have, for instance, much larger like Nuggets downtown Falls. That's one of the ideas that I said would not make sense. But virtually anything that didn't make sense, we were an open book. And what we did is we came up with 23 regional alternatives. That's what we call a long list of regional alternatives that fell out of phase 1. And you'll also see that a lot of the regional alternatives will have a sister alternative, like for instance, number 2 is Beacon Falls going to Seymour. We have number 2B, which is Beacon Falls to Seymour, with an aggressive I&I reduction. When I&I is basically trying to get rid of all that extreme rainwater that comes into the pipe. We were again trying to stay open, trying to identify truly the most comprehensive list of regional alternatives. We wanted to see if that was amenable, if that could help solve the problem by addressing very aggressive program of extracting that extreme water. Okay. So that's phase one. Let's talk about phase two. I wanted to remind you here in part, I'm kind of saying it, but I wanted to kind of show you a diagram that shows the methodology that we use to undertake this study. That first area where it says long list, see that on the screen, that's where all those 23 regional alternatives start. Then what we did was we developed a short list. From that long list, we need to narrow this down to one. So we went from the long list to the short list, and we looked at feasibility. Are these things feasible? What I told you before was we looked at feasibility within these things that were extremely obvious. The things that we weren't 100%, we made those come into the long list of alternatives. But when we shortlisted here at phase two, we shrunk that long list down to a manageable and best route. And then from there, we did even more intense evaluation to get that down to one and develop that regional alternative. We have a recommended wastewater alternative, recommended plan coming up right now. Okay, so what again in our own scope of work we did this work in tasks. So again, what task two attempted to do, or actually did, was to shortlist the regional wastewater alternatives from 23 down to 6. Task 3 was to get that short list and shrink it down to 1 using cross information as well. And then task 4, we really took a look at that recommended plan to phase and other things like that. So here it is right here. What we did was we were able to get that long list of 23 results of task 2 is what I'm telling you here. The long list of 23 regional alternatives, we brought that down to 6 regional alternatives that made the short list. The ones that fell out were that group of aggressive I alternatives that I was telling you about. And we just couldn't convince ourselves that that was something measurable as engineers and planners. We felt that while some communities around the country have taken advantage of that and been successful, we wouldn't stand by and think that that was going to be the cure-all for this group. And then we also removed the Beacon Falls and Naugatuck alternatives. And the reason is that I think everybody here knows that it gets pretty mountainous north of here. And it gets hilly, but it gets mountainous, especially up in the Beacon Falls and Naugatuck area. And the distances are pretty long as well. So those conduits that would connect Beacon Falls to Naugatuck are going to be on the order of 5 to 6 miles long. And because of the mountainous conditions, we were also going to have to put a number of high lift pumping stations there. Coming south from Beacon Falls to Seymour, it's a little less mild in topography, not a lot more mild, but it's definitely more mild and more horny. But the distances are really great. You have as many pumping stations coming south. So we just felt that that was not feasible. Not delivering the water, delivering wastewater. Wastewater, I think, everybody knows, as solids in it, as a lot of things, whatever you flush out to the toilet, whatever goes down to the house. So we felt it was not feasible. Those were not feasible alternatives to keep Beacon Falls in the mix. Next slide. So what came out of task 2? Here it is. We had 6 regional alternatives. 4 of those are centered at Ansonia, and 2 of them are centered at Dunn. What I mean by that is that 4 of the regional alternatives had a regional plan at Ansonia, with the other communities coming to it. Derby coming to it as one regional alternative, and then another regional alternative at Derby and Seymour coming to it. So We also had a subset there. We also had a subset there where we can actually pipe treated effluent from Ansonia back down to Derby, to the Housatonic River. And the reason we can do that is because the Naugatuck River has more treatment requirements, which can make it less expensive to pipe flow back to the Derby discharge point, where discharges to the Housatonic River are much larger river, significantly greater pollution. It's also a tidal river that has brackish water that into the phosphorus from that receiving water. So the next alternative, the next thing we did was we went to task 3, where we took that group of 6 shortlisted regional alternatives, we brought it down to 1 recommended alternative. And we did that by developing the alternatives further. We had even more conversations with the staff. We looked at plans, we looked at reports, we took photographs, we discussed it internally, we discussed it numerous times with the staff. We wanted to make sure that the program that we were implementing were on point. Again, we're in a planning study, and we applied a lot of engineering knowledge to bring those alternatives, to make those alternatives viable. We were originally doing that because we wanted to set the cost of it. Okay, so I'm just doing the next few slides. We're just going to give you a little bit of a preview as to what those base case and regional alternative development look like. Next slide. So we've already heard that the Derby plant needs a lot of improvement, pretty much through all of its treatment facilities and the non-treatment, like critical lines of facilities, like the electrical system. The entire plant electrical system really needs a major overhaul. And so the picture on the left communicates the color scheme. The blue green is where we're upgrading facilities. The blue is where we're saying the facilities will be new. I think that's a little bit missing saying is all of our reports can be found on NVCOG's website, which we're going to provide you at the very end of this presentation. So what we're giving you tonight is just the tip of the iceberg. Hopefully it's enough so that we can have a meaningful discussion and understanding what we did, but the details of those reports, we encourage you to go there. If you have questions, certainly we can discuss them. Okay, the Ansonia base case facility, the list on the right is smaller. Naturally, we would expect that to be smaller. Those are the facility needs that we identified for the Ansonia plant so that we could have a full service, reliable, and redundant operation for a base case scenario. And again, the Seymour facility, we've identified this one as well. The list gets long again here on the right, the photo on the left, where we've identified the treatment plant, the main treatment processes, and we've identified the areas that need improvement and upgrade there. So I'm showing you the Ansonia regional alternative plan. So this is the central plan at Ansonia. It's a great plan for this for a number of reasons. Number one, it was designed just like standards in every facet of life, whether it's teaching or medical. Engineering standards get upgraded as well. So engineering standards today are a lot more conservative than engineering standards when these original plans were designed in the 1960s and 1970s. So this plant, as it's configured today, as it's upgraded today, has those more current, more modern standards, which is good because standards are upgraded because previous standards have been built on current standards, right? So we need some additional treatment capacity as well. But it's a good facility for central facility. Just because it was a good facility for central facility, we still didn't know what the answer was even at this point. We're still in development. Okay? So now I'm just giving you a sneak preview that the conveyance pipelines, the pipelines that are required to go from one community to another. Basically, we have the Ansonia facility. This is the regional conveyance pipelines and pumping requirements for a central facility at Ansonia. So basically, we have raw wastewater after receiving some preliminary treatment at Seymour, just partial treatment, very partial treatment. It's essentially raw wastewater without the heavy grit and the heavy screenings. And that raw wastewater will flow through a pipeline to the Ansonia plant. Likewise, from the Derby facility, after screening, that wastewater will also be pumped up to the Ansonia facility for treatment. And this figure just tries to indicate that pipeline route from Derby to Ansonia and also from Seymour to Ansonia. There's been a lot of work on this. I would just like to communicate that we for the longest time, we were calling these corridors. We knew that there would be a corridor of possibilities where this pipe could be routed from Seymour to Ansonia, from Derby to Ansonia. And during the course of our study, we tried to come up with the most meaningful and best routes. We were looking for routes that were going to be non-disruptive to the environment. We were going to be looking at routes that we could build in streets that could accommodate a sewer. We're not talking about very large sewers. We're not talking about anything that's 36 or 48 inch size right this time. But these are some of the routes that we picked. I do want to say we can easily look at additional analysis here for more optimum quality, and that will be done in detail design, as Rick said. Okay, so now we've got a lot of definition on the plants. We've got a lot of definition on pipelines. We don't have plans where we're doing quantity takeoffs, which is for contractors. We have a great deal of knowledge base at Black Beach on how to project capital costs, even early on when we don't have plans. So we develop capital costs for the plants, we develop capital costs for those conveyance pipelines, for the regional alternatives. We also had to take into account operations and maintenance costs, because in order to compare these alternatives, we're not just comparing the initial cost. Yeah, a lot of people like to do that. We like to do that too. But we don't just compare alternatives that have a lifetime, that have a year in and year of operations and maintenance expenditure. It is not an important comparison to just comparing capital costs. What we're doing is we're using a Black Beach, engineers like Black Beach, you call present work analysis method that allows us to capture capital costs and then O&M costs over a period of time, this takes 20 years, to bring that back to a present value cost. Basically, the present work cost is a way for us to compare those alternatives. This slide tries to do that pictorially. On the left side, we've taken those two Derby regional alternatives, we've assigned capital costs and O&M costs to them. Then what we've done is for the base case, which is you all staying along with the upgrades that would be required as we've identified. We identified capital costs and O&M costs for those, and we also did that for the Ansonia regional alternatives, the 4 regional alternatives. We've taken capital costs, we've taken the present work, the 20-year O&M costs, and we developed the present work for each of those, and the ones that have finally shown us this stage study that were most financially attractive were the Ansonia regional alternatives. That's what came out of that work, and with present work numbers, its lowest present work cost is the most favorable compared to another. So what this slide does is it captures, it's the slide that we use to summarize the result of the present work cost analysis. So what we have here is we have a large table, and now we ask that we kind of focus on the left side of the table and the right side of the table. First, let's take a look at the left side of the table, where we have regional alternatives, we have capital costs for regional alternatives, we have the present work costs of the O&M, and then we have a total O&M, total present work cost. On the right-hand side, we have those base case scenarios where the three communities are staying alone, like Rick said, look at it as three communities. We've taken those capital costs for the Ansonia, Seymour, and Derby base case, capital costs, the present work of the O&M, the annual O&M that would be required to develop a total present work cost. In the rightmost column is the present work difference. And the Derby regional alternatives were basically the worst in terms of cost, financial attractiveness, because even staying alone as the base case alternative is more favorable than regionalizing at Derby. However, for the Ansonia regional alternatives, the Ansonia regional alternatives are superior, are more financially attractive than the base case. We've highlighted two of them that are all four Ansonia regional alternatives are more favorable than the base case scenario. But we've identified two of them in particular, Derby plus Seymour, two Ansonia with the effluent pump back with the Housatonic, and just Derby and Ansonia teaming up as a regional entity, and also piping that flow back to the Housatonic. So, but the one that has all three communities, Seymour and Derby, both going to Ansonia for treatment, full treatment, and then discharging that clarified that is the most favorable one from an environmental perspective. You're getting rid of two wastewater treatment plants in their entirety from the northern side. Okay, so I'm just going to say two things about what else did you do after that. So we started developing the recommended alternative, and what Will and his team did a lot of here is we started taking that pipeline from Seymour, that pipeline from Derby, coming to the Ansonia facility, and started to actually lay out and see what that looks like. What are the bottlenecks? Is there anything else that we learned in this development stage that would impact the feasibility of this alternative or its financial merits? So we never rested on our laurels even after identifying recommended alternatives. Continue to do the work. We want to understand this is a major program. This would be a major program. We've got Seymour coming to Ansonia. We've got Derby going to Ansonia. We've got commissioning activities. We've got decommissioning activities. We've got timing. So we want to think that through, and that's what this task force allowed us to do. But we did the same thing with the pipelines, with the two conveyance pipelines. We started taking a look at, crossings under Route 8, crossings under the railroad, and how those would occur. So that's the type of detail that we developed in this task force. We also laid out a schedule. We've programmed 5 years for this entire effort to not only do the engineering investigations, but the survey, environmental work that's required to satisfy the regulatory agencies, then design and design these facilities, and then get them into construction and get them information. So that's what this schedule endeavors to do. We think we didn't be done in less time, but we know that we need to allow time for everybody to weigh in, not just like research, but involve new folks, regulatory agencies. So we've allotted 5 years. We think that's doable, including the commission. Okay, so another thing that we did in that last stage is for the first time, we took a look at project funding opportunities. And I think you folks know that for eligible wastewater projects here in the state of Connecticut, he basically administers and manages the Clean Water Fund Assistance Program for municipal projects. And if the project is eligible, we've been in dialogue with you throughout this project. An eligible project will receive 20% grant, and the balance of that will be about the remaining 80% of that eligible project will be handled through a local trust. That's an important financial perspective. But shifting gears, we know also that we're talking about a regional authority in this case, or I'm sorry, a regional entity. So the state of Connecticut has a great statute on its books, Connecticut State General Statute Section 22A-500, that is established for the purpose of setting up a true wastewater utility. That its whole function is to be accountable to the community, accountable to itself, for the purpose of servicing, providing top-grade wastewater service that meets all the regulations as efficiently as possible, and programs those activities in a reliable manner. And the benefit of that is the one significant benefit of that is that the wastewater regional authority also gets a higher grant percentage. Instead of a 20% grant, it would get a 25% grant on its initial project. Also, as you know, the state of Connecticut, sometimes the money is there, just like in all states. Sometimes the money is there, sometimes it's not. A regional entity would have, because it's serving a greater population, it would be serving the benefits of all three communities, not standalone community. Also, because it has greater environmental benefits, we have seen private agencies, certainly deeply speak for this themselves, but often those projects are more funded. So that's an additional benefit. And I've also mentioned that it becomes a greater accountability. The whole purpose of this regional is wastewater service to its customers, to the environment. So what we've done is we've repeated that table that we showed you before on the results of the present work analysis. And this time we've taken into account the grant. So the left-hand side, which is the regional alternative side, takes into account a 25% grant, which wasn't in the first time, previous slide that I showed you, like this. And the base case looks at a 20% grant for capital projects. And not only does this analysis corroborate what we did before, but the savings are becoming greater because of the greater percentage of financial grant that's offered to a regional entity. So in alternative 5B, which is Dunn plus Seymour to Ansonia, with the effluent pump to the Housatonic River, is the recommended alternative. And again, it not only provides the greatest financial benefit, but also the greatest environmental benefits of all the alternatives that we would have to do. So thank you very much for your attention, and we'll look forward to some questions later. We have David and Sarah give their part of the presentation.
Thank you, Mario. Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming out tonight. My name is Sarah Concanon, and I'm with my colleague David Colton. And we're going to take you through a summary of the work that we've been doing with Black and Veatch and NVCOG over the last year or so. Next slide, please. So first, what I wanted to do is take a minute to introduce the Collins Center, because we're a little bit of a unique organization, and I want to make sure everyone understands what we do. Our center is located at UMass Boston, as Rick mentioned, and we provide consulting services and technical assistance to cities, towns, state agencies, and other public sector organizations in New England. We do all manner of things, we cover all manner of topics under the umbrella of public management and governance. And we're really guided by our mission, which is to improve the efficiency, effectiveness, governance, responsiveness, and accountability of public sector organizations. So, we're a cross-disciplinary team of practitioner consultants. We like to call ourselves practitioner consultants, and collectively we have decades of experience in public sector organizations. As a member of the NVCOG team, along with Black and Veatch, we bring expertise in financial analysis, in governance and organizational structures, the legal underpinnings of regional wastewater systems, the facilitation of organizational change from beginning to end, and also a sensitivity to local history, local control, and issues of equity and representation. Next slide. So our job in this study we had two tasks. First was to recommend an ownership and a governance model for the recommended regional alternative, including drafting a regional bylaws and a sewer ordinance. And the second task was to complete a financial analysis of the recommended regional alternative that would show costs, both capital and operating, in the regional model for each of the municipalities that end up being involved in the costs. So we joined the team sort of in between phase 1 and phase 2. The first thing we did was really get up to speed on what had already been done in phase 1 and what Black and Veatch was going to undertake in phase 2. We were doing our work alongside them during their phase 2 work. So the first thing that we did once we got up to speed was go and interview the WPCA officials and staff. And I want to reiterate what Mario said. We found everybody to be very helpful, very forthcoming, and the interviews were very illuminating in terms of what was going on at the authorities, in terms of their budgets, really. And we did ask for a lot of information, a lot of financial data. That was the next sort of step in our process, was to gather as much data as we could about what was going on the ground. What did the financial picture of the WPCAs look like, as well as some additional external research. As Mario noted, we held 3 stakeholder workshops, and we did that in collaboration with Black and Veatch. And our job at the workshops was really to provide an update on what we had learned, what we were thinking, and gather feedback, which, by the way, was very useful feedback. We went through a rigorous process of reviewing and editing our work with not only the stakeholders, but Black and Veatch and the NVCOG staff, before we finalized our findings, which we are presenting to you here tonight. So briefly, I just want to let you know what we're going to talk about. We have 3 things that we want to present to you. First is our recommendation for the ownership model. And my colleague David's going to talk about that next. I'm going to then take it and walk you through our financial analysis, and talk about the findings and next steps. And then David's going to wrap up the evening by talking about the governance model.
Thank you, Sarah. So what do we mean when we talk about ownership model? Really, there's 2 main types of ownership for these kinds of regions. One would be that the regional authority owns the entirety of the system, the wastewater collection system, the conveyance system, all of the pumping stations, the treatment facility, and disposal. It owns soup to nuts. We own system. And that would be a full regional ownership. The other model is a partial ownership model, and there can be variations of this, but essentially the collection systems in the individual member communities are remain under the ownership of the community, and the regional authority only owns the treatment and disposal aspects of the system. We recommend in urban Black Beach on this that full ownership is the way to go. Next slide. So full ownership is a simple diagram just to show you how it works. And then the key thing here is that those local WPCAs will be dissolved, and the users of the system, the residences and the businesses in the communities would have a direct customer service relationship with the regional water pollution control authority that would be responsible for setting user regulations and user fees and limits. Next. As noted by Mario earlier, regionalization presents an opportunity to take advantage of economies of scale. Full ownership optimizes that opportunity, particularly in the area of regulatory compliance. If you think about it, if you have three separate water pollution control authorities, three separate towns, each one has to have a permit. They have to go through a permitting process, and those permitting processes can be quite time-consuming and quite expensive. By consolidating in a region, that's one way to optimize that by having that people are responsible for the entire system. There are other economies of scale in terms of labor and equipment that also come into play. So not only does the regulatory compliance issues involved, not only is this recommended that we prefer Black Beach, this is also preferred by the regulatory agency, because it simplifies and streamlines the compliance issues, and it makes them all rational across all three towns. Everybody's playing by the same rules. So with that,
Thank you, David. And the reason that we wanted to talk about the ownership model first is because the ownership model impacts the financial model. And so just sort of to bridge these two sections, there was really broad consensus that the full ownership model was the way to go, not only amongst the stakeholders, the project teams, and deep. So we moved forward with a full ownership model as we were constructing our financial analysis. So we want to start at the top with the big picture. The big picture is that we agree with Black and Veatch's conclusion that the recommended alternative saves money compared with the base case for the scenario where the three communities move forward on their own. Our analysis, building on the work that Black and Veatch did with regard to costs, our analysis shows that the recommended regional alternative would save $66.5 million over the 20-year period that we included in our model. You might be wondering why our savings differ from Black and Veatch's. As I mentioned, we build on Black and Veatch and the work that they did. They did a present worth comparison that expresses the relative savings of the various regional alternatives in current dollars, whereas we modeled annual costs just the recommended alternative, and we accumulated those savings over the 20 years. Next slide. So in order for you all to understand what you're going to hear, I want you to have at least a basic understanding of our model's inputs and some of the assumptions that we made as we were building the model. So we have four big cost categories that we call inputs in the model. So the first one is O&M. This is the operation and maintenance costs that you heard Mario mention. Another way to refer to it is the operating budget. So in our base case scenarios, the O&M costs are based on the FY21 WPCA operating budget. So the actual budgets that you are currently operating under. In the regional alternative, we took the O&M costs that Black and Veatch projected, we annualized them so that we had a number for each of the years. And then we adjusted them upward by 9%. And that was really to account for some components that we did not see reflected in Black and Veatch's numbers, things like administrative overhead and pension costs. And across the period of the model, we used a 2% annual inflation rate. The second cost category is the existing debt. So your WPCAs, some of them have existing debt. And so we included that in our model as reported by the WPCAs. The third cost category is new debt. What we did was take Black and Veatch's projected new debt and amortized it so that we could project the annual cost of the debt service. We made the assumption that the capital projects would be funded through the Clean Water Fund that Mario described. It's a 20-year term with 2% interest with a level debt repayment. We didn't at this stage of the process model any borrowing costs or short-term borrowing. And the reason for that is that really happens much closer to when you're actually issuing debt. So we're not able to do that at this time. That would happen in several years. One important difference, as Mario mentioned, is that in the base case, when the municipalities are going in a loan, they only get a 20% grant through that Clean Water Fund. But under the regional alternative, there's a 5% bonus, and so the grant in that case is 25%. The last cost category is pay-go capital, pay-as-you-go capital. That's capital improvements that you pay for with current dollars. It's what you pay in cash. And the reason you can do that is because the improvements are less costly and it just makes more financial sense to buy it outright. So there are collection cost projections that Black and Veatch did, and they're divided into phases. For the phase 2 collection costs, which are some lower cost investments, we treated those as pay-as-you-go. And we also added a non-infrastructure capital cost, which really accounts for things like vehicles and equipment. Some of the vehicles and equipment that your WPCAs will use on a daily basis, like trucks and things like that. And we assumed that cost would be equivalent to 3% of the annual O&M budget. Just some additional assumptions so that folks can understand. So we used a similar timeline, not exactly the same as Black and Veatch. The regional WPCA would be formed in FY22, which is the current fiscal year now. The phase 1 collection system investments can begin more quickly. They'll begin in FY23 with debt repayment starting in 24. For the pumping station treatment and conveyance capital, that needs more time to be developed and planned. So we assumed engineering would happen in 23, construction would happen in 24 and 25, and first debt repayment would begin in FY26. One additional important assumption for you to understand is that we assumed that any reserves or any stabilization funds that the current WPCAs have will remain with the municipalities. They could be used to stabilize user rates during or after the transition to regionalization, or they could be used for any legal purpose. But the bottom line is that any funds that your WPCAs have held in reserve would not be transferred to the regional entity. so I want to kind of, before I show you the numbers, I want to talk a little bit about how the money gets allocated, how the cost gets allocated. We call it the cost allocation methodology. So while we know that regionalization saves money overall, we really had to determine what's the impact at the municipal level. There are a lot of different ways that regional wastewater systems allocate costs, and I've provided 3 examples, and the reason I'm giving you these examples is because I want you to really understand there's a lot of good, legitimate ways to allocate costs. So the first example is the Mattabesett district. So in the Mattabesett district, the O&M costs are allocated based on a 5-year average flow. The capital costs are allocated based on the member municipalities' reserved plant capacity. The second example comes from the Mass Water Resources Authority. In that case, the O&M costs are allocated based on a 3-year average flow with adjustments for strength of flow. And the capital costs are allocated based on a combination of 3 factors. So the first is the 3-year average peak month flow and the average concentration of total suspended solids and biological oxygen demand. Thank you, David. The second factor is the proportion of population of the community that's served in the system. And the third factor is the proportion of the community census population to the total census population of the enterprise system. The third example is the Mansfield Foxborough Norton district, or the MFN district. The O&M costs are coded in 2 ways. They can either be flow variable or semi-fixed. Those flow variable costs are allocated based on average flow. The semi-variable O&M, or the semi-fixed O&M rather, excuse me, and the capital costs are allocated based on reserved plant capacity. So it's not important the specifics, but what I want you to walk away with after this slide is an understanding that the cost allocation can differ, that there are a lot of different ways to do it, and that there are many legitimate ways to do it. All right, so that said, who decides? It's not us. It's really the member municipalities. It's their right, it's their responsibility to make that decision. And it's something that they're going to have to actively negotiate to design a cost allocation methodology that is acceptable to everyone. And the agreed upon methodology should be defined in a formal agreement. So what we did was look at some of the factors of the arrangement. We looked at the relative sizes of the communities, the relative proportion of wastewater flow. We looked at the strength of the influent, and we came up with what we feel is a really good starting point for a cost allocation methodology. And this slide summarizes it. So there are 3 cost categories that are allocated based on the proportion of Black and Veatch's total estimated annual flow. Because Black and Veatch did a lot of good work to project the flow into the future. So we took that information and we allocated O&M costs, we allocated treatment and conveyance capital, both existing and new, and we allocated pay-as-you-go capital on that basis. We allocated collection and pumping capital, both existing and new, based on a different factor. We allocated that based on municipal orders. And before we move on, I want to just say one comment about what do I mean by existing capital? Well, as I mentioned, the WPCAs have existing debt. So, for example, Ansonia is still paying for its treatment plant. Under the regional recommended alternative, Ansonia's current debt would be allocated amongst the 3 communities based on estimated annual flow. Conversely, Derby has just issued debt for a pumping station. That debt would stay the responsibility of Derby under our model. Next slide, please. All right, so once we run the model based on all of those inputs and all of those assumptions that I just tried to and hopefully did explain clearly, this is the bottom line output. So the top group there shows the aggregate. So you can see with Ansonia, Derby, and Seymour together, under the base case, so if they're all going it alone, it will cost $328.7 million over the 20 years. Under the recommended regional alternative, it will cost only $262 million. That's where we get that savings of $66.5 million. As you move down the table, you can see there is a block for each of the communities. So in Ansonia, the base case is projected to cost $102.8 million, whereas the cost to Ansonia within the regional model, regional system, is $97 million. So that's an estimated savings of $5.75 million. For Derby, you can see that the base case is estimated to cost $143 million, whereas the regional alternative would cost Derby $100 million, resulting in a savings of $42.6 million. And then finally, for Seymour, you can see that the base case is projected to cost $82.9 million, whereas the regional alternative would cost them $64 million, resulting in a savings of $18 million. So there are some next steps on the financial side. We do recommend that our cost allocation methodology be adopted as a starting point for ongoing negotiations. There are a couple of reasons. Number one, all of the municipalities can save money compared with going it alone. So it's a good place to start. The second reason is that each municipality continues to be responsible for the existing and future capital costs associated with its collection system. And there's a reason that we did this. At this stage of the process, we feel it's important because we don't really know, we don't have a detailed assessment of the collection systems. We can't really parse the relative conditions of the collection systems. We know they're all bad, but we don't know much more than that. We really don't have a very exact projection of what the future capital needs are, and so we feel that the municipalities should continue to maintain responsibility for the investments that they've made in the past in those collection systems, or in some cases the lack of investment. So what are the next steps specifically around the cost allocation methodology? We do think that there's an important piece of the puzzle missing, and that's having values on the existing treatment assets. We don't really know the current value of those assets, and that's something that you have to do with an asset valuation expert. We really think that that step could improve the financial model and allow the municipalities, as they undergo a negotiation, to consider some sort of buy-in arrangement that could enhance the equity of the projected savings across the three communities. And I'm going to turn it back to my colleague David.
Thank you, Sarah. So, governance models. In order to make a recommendation on the governance model, we wouldn't take for granted that we would use the Connecticut model statute. We wanted to take a broader picture, take a look at what other regional wastewater districts have done. And so to get a decent sample size, we expanded our view to southern of that. So we looked at a dozen or so regional wastewater departments. There's only a few in Connecticut, so and many more in Massachusetts. So this helped us assess the differences. There are really two basic ways to establish a regional district. One is with some kind of model legislation. Connecticut has model legislation, which is Chapter 446K, Section 22A, that Mario alluded to earlier. Massachusetts has a model that is used in some places in Massachusetts. There's also the 80 under the underlying the neighborhood legislation, there would have to be a whole series of other documents, such as ordinances, bylaws, in some cases, intergovernmental agreements, and as Sarah said earlier, not finally find both drafts of both ordinances and bylaws. Next. So we concur that the best way to establish a region in this case is utilizing the Connecticut model statute. The reason for that is that it has an established practice. It's in use already in Connecticut, the Haven district uses it, and it's successful. It's timely. Adopting special legislation would be time consuming. It has to be started from scratch and negotiated and written. And at the end of the day, you end up with many of the same provisions that are model legislation. So why not save the time? Just model legislation. It meets all the established criteria set by the state, which will aid in the improvements that we need. The grant funding, it's been said, I'll say it again, there's a 5% bump in grant funding if you utilize the Connecticut model statute. The Connecticut model statute is comprehensive. It has been vetted. It contains all the necessary language that establishes a district formation, financing, land acquisition, planning, construction, and staff selection. So, as I said earlier, there will be a number of documents that have to be adopted under the model legislation. First, and probably most important, is that each legislative body in the communities must concurrently adopt an ordinance that establishes the water use control. And we have provided an NVCOG a draft of that ordinance. Along with the ordinance, there would have to be a preliminary plan of operation that would have to be developed by the communities with their various engineers and staffs on how they're going to operate the district in the interim as things as we get now. Both of those documents must be approved by the Deed Commissioner and the State Treasurer. State Treasurer is involved, of course, because of the funding. The ordinance is that would establish a board of directors that then adopt rules and regulations and hires officers. The board of directors would also be subject to the set of bylaws. Maintaining local representation in each member community is very important for obvious reasons, I think, but it maintains a connection between the users and the people who pay. So we are not recommending things change very much in that bid. We're proposing that the members of the board of directors be appointed in the same name that they're appointed. Say if you're appointed by a mayor now, so each community would appoint 3 members. They would be on staggered terms. And they would have to, of course, reside in the district and have some relevant environmental engineering or financial knowledge or experience. getting, setting rates, adopting the budget, that it required 6 votes, 6 of the 9 members, and that at least one voting member from each community must be among this group. So we propose this because we believe that it is really a best practice to have a system that encourages consensus, so that everybody gets on the same page and moves forward in a fashion. So there's some key provisions we ordered some bylaws I just want to mention. So these key provisions are there to hold the directors and officers accountable and transparent. By transparency, the board would put the officers, including an executive director, treasurer, and secretary. The executive director would give the operating capital budget approval. A key component would be an annual cost of service study that would be required of the new regional authority. This is very important to make sure that the rate, the fee that the user ends up paying relates back to the cost, so that it's transparent. Anybody can see this is what it costs, and this is how it translates through the budget, through the rate, and it's all professional. We'll also require, of course, that any public agency annual audit would be by an external independent auditor. And of course, we want to mention earlier, we have to super users. So what happens now? First, we should recognize that we've come a long way in this process, and that the local governments have been the process and we value and deal with it. But there's still a lot of work to be done. The tremendous amount of work done by NVCOG needs to take it to the next level. Our cost allocation model is a starting point for the next set of milestones. Really, the time has come for the municipalities to play a greater role in developing these plans further, and really work towards an equitable sharing savings. So we really, again, repeat what Sarah said about hiring the asset valuation consultant to assess the value of the infrastructure. That is something that will definitely on and lead towards great equity. Negotiating specifics of the cost allocation, incorporating that to a legal agreement. Finalizing it, that cost allocation agreement, the ordinance and bylaws and provided with legal counsel, deep with other stakeholders. That the preliminary plan of operation has to be developed. The legislative bodies need to adopt the cost allocation agreement, the ordinance, bylaws, after what we would recommend be a robust public meeting process. And then what that seek approval from these state directors. And that was then lead to the plan. So thank you. Appreciate your attention, and we're happy to address any questions.
Thank you, David. So here we are. Not bad, an hour and 15 minutes for everyone. It wasn't that bad. We have questions that have come in online during the presentation. We'll take questions from people in the room as well. I do want to apologize to the people who are watching on YouTube and some of them on Zoom who are having trouble hearing what we're saying. It's been kind of at the mercy of a different type of hybrid meeting here, so it's been difficult to get the sound out over apparently all over the system. But we did, some people could apparently hear us because John Sackey submitted 8 questions. What I want to do is, if I could, just address, make sure that John's questions are addressed. Some of them, a lot of them go to assumptions that are underlying, and I want to kind of get those out of the way with the consultant team. And then some of the questions have to do that I think were answered after they were asked. So I'll try and summarize those and get through those, and then we'll take questions from the audience. So actually, the first question had to do with, is more in the way of underlying assumptions. Probably from Mario as well. The question is how you consider the cost of hauling sludge versus renovating the belt presses in the base case or in the regional case. How did you approach that? And I need you to talk right into that microphone.
Yeah, that is a good question, and we did consider it. We looked at the equipment for dewatering right now, and the dewatering equipment is quite old at Derby facility and also at Seymour facility, and so that was taken into account as part of our overall analysis of the sludge process.
Thanks, Martin. John also had a question about the approval process. I think we answered it. His question was whether DEEP approved the regional plan or 3 individual plans. I think the safe answer to that question is if you choose to pursue a regional authority under the statute that David described, then it would be a single regional plan that would get submitted. If you decide not to go forward, the towns do not join together, then the towns would continue to go in individually and submit and get approval of that plan. Anybody disagree? John also asked a question about, I think it was confusion about the customer service relationship. The regional authority has a direct relationship with the customer and would deal with any sort of service issue or question or billing issue. It's a direct relationship. I think all of the other questions were eventually answered. You did ask a question. Let's go through the assumptions. Sarah, I think this might be for you, David. The question has to do with projected reserves or existing reserves from the existing organizations versus projected reserve, whether you included reserves in the regional system. Could you just talk about what would happen to the reserves that currently belong to those individual systems, and then what would be original reserve?
Sure. So any reserves or any stabilization funds that are currently held as assets, cash assets, by the existing WPCAs would remain the property of the municipalities. When the WPCAs are dissolved, the assumption is that the successor organizations for any assets that would remain would be the sort of home municipalities. So those reserve funds would not transfer and become the property of the regional authority. That's the assumption in our model. But we did not build into our model any reserve buildup for the regional authority. That would be a policy decision of the board of directors, certainly one we would support though.
Thank you, Sarah. So I'm going to change glasses so I can see you guys up there and take questions from the audience now. Is there any questions here? Anyone? Jack Walsh? Jack, I'm going to repeat it to the people online after you say it.
When the legislative body, they will You don't have. So when,
So the question is, when do the municipalities take over the process? Is that correct? Okay. So I don't know who wants to address that under the statute and the amount, right?
So at the time, the authorities, the local legislative bodies adopt the ordinance, they would also dissolve the existing WPCA. So I think that would be one major portion of the operation, preliminary operation, how you would transition from the existing WPCAs to the authority. As far as when that process starts, that's up to them, up to the three communities, and they could start tonight if they want to, theoretically.
So, I mean, I addressed this a little bit in my opening comments. The three towns have to make a decision whether they're going to pursue this. The homework is done. The numbers have been calculated. They're fair, even comparisons done on the same basis. And they project between the base case of going it alone and a regional system, a difference of more than $65 million in 20 years. So the question for the towns is, do they want to get together, sit down with those numbers, and work out a system that's beneficial for everyone? I think that's really where it's at this point in terms of next step there.
when the
Well, it's up to this. The question is when the city officials take over the process. I think as David said, they can take over tonight. We're going to publish this report. This is the last public session of this process. We're going to publish the report. And the towns can adopt the recommendations in any way they see fit. It's our hope, it's my hope, that the three communities will be led by their chief elected officials. We'll discuss it with their legislative bodies and determine that they can at least meet and discuss how to allocate the numbers and whether they want to pursue this. There would need to be a negotiation. I mean, you saw the numbers. I think everybody saw the numbers allocated by town, savings versus or the benefits allocated. When you look at those numbers, I don't think any fair-minded person would say that the city of Derby should gain $46 million in benefit when they haven't spent a dime over, well, I don't say about that, but haven't spent any real money to keep maintaining the system over a 30-year period. So, that money should be allocated more fairly in other ways. Ansonia has maintained a valuable plant that is worth something. They have a real asset going into this. Therefore, they don't gain as much benefit by the comparison. That's the negotiation. That's the crux of the negotiation. And whether the three towns working together can make those savings accrue fairly to all users in all three towns. So Mr. Walsh's point is that while there are savings in this, rates will continue to increase based upon just inflation and cost of work. You want to comment on that also?
Well, I think that he makes a great point, and I think maybe Veatch will want to echo or say more about this, but the reality is that regionalization saves money compared with what y'all are facing if you go it alone. Your plants, your systems require significant capital upgrades, so you've got an opportunity to take a slightly different path together that will cost less than the path you'll be walking on your own. Is that fair? Do you want to add anything, Ryan?
I think you said that well, Sarah. Basically, it's, you work alone and pay more, you work together as a regional entity and pay less. So, yeah, we agree.
Yes, yeah, rates will go up over time, absolutely. That's it. So just so the people who are online, that's why I keep repeating this. The $65 million in savings is over the cost that you would incur by going it alone. Costs are gonna go up no matter how you slice it. The gentleman right here is saying.
My name is Sean Massey. I'm a resident of Ansonia. I'm also a member of the Ansonia WPCA, currently chairman. I'm going into my second year in that position. I just want to say that in my time with the WPCA, I have not seen anyone at our meetings discuss this. We go to great lengths to make sure that our rates stay down. There's accountability in Ansonia. We have aldermen on our commission. If people have a problem, they literally can go knock on somebody's door, and call the cell phone and say, hey, this is the problem, and bring it up at a meeting. I don't know how making the regional WPCA or adding a larger body of government is going to make anything better or easier. I also don't understand how, I mean, the business model that it's set up right now is that the entity will take over the asset. That's definitely not fair to Ansonia. I can see how Seymour, Derby would be willing to give over their plants because they haven't done anything. Our ratepayers have been paying down that plant since 2011. And what the repairs that we do need of Black and Beach, such we need, can be done at I would assume a much favorable rate to our ratepayers than to stick it all together in one big shot. I don't understand how this goes. My big question is the sewers themselves, the piping. Talk about the infiltration of water. Will that organization take over the maintenance and installation of that infrastructure as well?
Thank you, Mr. Massey from Ansonia from the WPCA. I will, before I move, I want to address one comment. We have worked closely with staff and board members on all three WPCAs. Your chairman was invited to participate as well as Richie. Richie Bashir, who participated in this process and provided information. And you know, it's not like we've been doing this in secret. So I don't know what to tell you about your lack of connection to the process. But I would ask the consultant team to address the last point, Mr. Mason. Sure. I don't think I can.
I think
Like, who's responsible for the infrastructure?
Thank you for the collection system. So David or Sarah, I didn't want to talk about the full ownership model, and what that means for the collection system.
Sure, and I think I'll also talk about the finance question that he had. My understanding, and Black Beach, I think, is agreeing that the regional authority would be responsible for all the maintenance, all the upgrades, and would control and own the collection system. So everything would be transferred.
Yeah, that is absolutely correct. That's the only way that you're going to make them accountable. They need to own it, they need to maintain it, they need to operate.
That includes the pipes under the ground, all the way around town.
Yes,
Correct.
entire collection system, pump stations, pipes, everything.
And if I may, I want to answer his other question that was in the middle of the comments that he made, and that was really around the financial analysis. So there's a couple of things to unpack there. First, I will say that the model that we have now does show savings for Ansonia ratepayers under the regional system compared with going it alone. The savings are not as large as you saw for the other two communities, but it is going to cost Ansonia residents, or ratepayers rather, less to be part of this regional model than to be alone. The second point I want to make, and because he's absolutely correct, that there is value in the treatment plant at Ansonia, and Rick mentioned it as well. And that's why we really feel that the next step is getting an asset valuation expert in to look at the assets, the treatment plant assets, and there will be some value because there'll be some systems at Derby that will be part of the regional system, right? There'll be some, you guys talked to this, there's something there that will have value. Am I wrong?
Yeah, no, there's value in all of the systems. The question is how much. And the question that you said is, by virtue of its newness, you surmise that the Ansonia facility would have greater value, and we would agree with that assumption. The real question is how much, and how does that, and you need to, as Rick has been saying from the beginning, that's why I think communities, if this is a good idea that you feel should be brought to the next level, get some of this additional information. There's been an awful lot of information that's been provided and developed. That's all, we're only part of the way there. The rest of the way there is going to be gained with rolling up the speeds and having honest discussions.
And once if you do move forward and bring in an asset valuation expert who can give you some solid numbers about the value of the treatment facility and infrastructure, then that is an important piece of the puzzle in terms of, as Rick said and as I said, looking at the savings and looking at how they're allocated to the different municipalities, because we want to get to better equity, right? And we want everybody to feel satisfied that what they're doing is going to save them money and is fair, right? And that's really the goal. So part of the negotiation would be to take the findings of the asset valuation expert, put that into the model, and talk about potentially a buy-in arrangement. You know, will the other communities buy into the existing value of Ansonia to in one way reimburse the Ansonia ratepayers who have been paying off the treatment plant for the last number of years.
Further questions? Mr. Flaherty.
Yeah, good evening, Rick, members of the panel. For the record, my name is Ansonia Flaherty. I reside at 29 in Ansonia, and I thank you very much for being here and giving us this presentation. I do have a few questions. To Sean's point, I think that uppermost in Ansonia ratepayers' mind is how is it going to be carried? How is Ansonia going to their ratepayers, to our ratepayers, and say, well, you spent $50 million on a plant in Derby and Seymour coming in? I think there has to be parity, and I think it was a huge mistake that during this study, we didn't have that component locked down so that you could say, and Sean could say to ratepayers, well, you have, our plant is worth this, and there'd be a buy-in or something. I think that would be very helpful in selling this. Because right now you're talking, you know, $5 million savings over 20 years, and we're giving up an awful lot of autonomy. And if you look at some of the numbers, first, let me ask, what environmental benefits are accrued according to one of the slides by dumping it into the Housatonic? What environmental benefits?
The environmental benefit is that the Naugatuck River is substantially cleaner by eliminating 2 wastewater discharges. So the environmental benefit is to the Naugatuck River, and it does not in any way degrade the overall water quality of the Housatonic River as well. So a total benefit to the Naugatuck and no degradation to the Housatonic.
Well, you put phosphates back in, they're not going in. I mean, we're a quarter mile from the Housatonic River. It's not as if, you know, the Naugatuck River is totally alien. It's going into the Housatonic, a quarter mile upstream. It's kind of ludicrous that he requires that of Ansonia and not of Shelton or Derby. I mean, come on.
You're right, Art. In terms of phosphorus
concerns
treatment,
me-
the real question is why Ansonia should be required to do phosphorus treatment that close to the Housatonic River.
Well, my concern is if there's $148 million going into Long Island Sound cleanup, what happens if DEEP comes around in 2 years and says you can no longer dump phosphates into the Housatonic or the Naugatuck? Why don't we address this when you're rebuilding the plant to accommodate all the phosphate? That's environmental benefit. I can't see how environmental benefit accrues when you're putting phosphates in instead of taking it out. The other question I have on the governance, have you ever seen a model where the vote is based on flow? In other words, Ansonia has 18 million, Derby has 12 million. Derby has 3 votes, Ansonia has 3 votes. I don't see the parity. I have a problem with that. When the cost basis is going to be based on flow.
So let me just repeat it for the people who are listening online. The question is whether we have seen an operating model where the voting structure would be based on flow. Is that a fair restatement, Mark?
As the cost is. In other words, the cost is going to be based on flow. So also, shouldn't the voting rights be based on flow or something more equitable than 3, 3, and 3?
So Mr. Clary's point is that the cost allocation should be reflected based upon the amount of money paid by the users in each town to process the flow. I'm not trying to restate.
Or population. And then the last question I have is on the models, the flow and the meter volume doesn't compute for Derby. Your flow is more, a higher percentage than meter flow. And also, it doesn't seem right when you have a population of 12,000 versus 18,000, that the flow isn't that much different between Ansonia and Derby. Did you try to reconcile that somehow?
But Bart, I'm going to repeat it again for the people who are online. And 3 questions that I have. One has to do with discharge and environmental quality and whether we're improving it by the regional system versus the base case. The second question has to do with the representation of the towns and should representation of the voting rights be more closely aligned with the volume of flow and the number of users. And then the third question had to do with flow and metering between Derby and Ansonia, whether it's active. Right. Take that last one first, Mark.
Thank you.
Okay, go ahead.
So to answer your question, not really aware of any that do board representation directly based on flow. There are some that do board representation based on relative size of the member communities by either some kind of population or number of connections, but not necessarily flow. And I, I'll stand corrected if somebody knows of one that I'd love to hear about. But in the cases that we've seen where communities have been granted a additional vote based on greater population or greater size, the disparity has been large. It's been in the case of, Hartford having more votes than other communities in that district. The difference in size has been really a couple of order of magnitudes before you see additional representation. We do not feel that the differences in population among these three communities to be great enough based on the practice and everywhere else to warrant additional votes. That being said, this is our recommendation. There are probably, 5 or at least good ways that you can structure the pool. You can, it'd be up to, obviously up to the communities when they adopt that ordinance to determine how the pool is established. But based on the evidence that we've uncovered so far, a greater representation for, in this case, Ansonia, because it's the largest, is not warranted when you look at what the practices and ordinances.
And just one more, Rick, just to make it perfectly clear. This board of directors, this corporation is going to own the entire structure, not just the treatment plant, but it includes all the pump stations in all the towns. It includes all the piping in the grounds. And then they're going to be equally maintained. In other words, if Ansonia requires, I'll give you a perfect example. On Pershing Drive, within the last 2 years, we spent $1 million on repair. WPCA spent $1 million on repair to a pipe. Now, in this regional thing, what you're saying is Ansonia would spend $333,000, Derby would spend $333,000, Seymour would spend $333,000.
No.
Is that the type of ownership that you're talking about?
So there's a different assumption and different methodology for the collection system. The question for those of you out there, for Mr. Flaherty, was how the costs of the collection system updates and repairs will be shared between the three communities. And I'm gonna let Sarah answer that or David, because they actually looked at this and came up with a specific allocation.
Yes, thank you, Rick. So, this gets into the weeds, so I'm gonna try to make it clear, and if it's not, please definitely ask. So, the collection systems are owned by the regional authority. O&M costs associated with regular maintenance of the collection systems are allocated based on average flow. So those are variable, right? So if you have a budget line that says, I'm gonna spend $100,000 on collection system maintenance across the entire system, that would be allocated based on flow, so 40% Ansonia and so on. Collection system capital, right, a separate category than operating, but collection system capital is allocated based on municipal orders. So if there is a catastrophic collapse in the Ansonia, the formerly Ansonia WPCA collection system, that would be Ansonia ratepayers' responsibility. And this is not uncommon for a regional authority to allocate costs in this way and maintain a system of tracking where costs need to go. So I don't want you to think that this is totally out of left field. If there is something that has to be upgraded in Derby, in the old Derby collection system, these ratepayers that are within the Derby municipal borders would pay for it in its entirety. And so why did we do this? I want to reiterate why. We don't know necessarily, we don't have really good information about the condition of the collection systems. So if I'm representing one of the communities and I'm coming into the collection system or into the regional system with a collection system that has some hidden problems, and the day after we form our region, I have a catastrophic failure, I'm asking my neighbors to pay for my deferred maintenance. So I accrued benefit of not having my rates raised to make those regular investments. And yet now my neighbor across municipal boundaries is being asked to pay for it. We wanted to avoid that situation and avoid that concern. And that is why we made that decision in defining the cost allocation methodology. So to summarize, the efforts that Derby WPCA, Ansonia WPCA, and so on have made in the past are theirs to deal with financially in the future when it comes to collection systems.
I'm not questioning the methodology. I just want clarification, because at one point the statement was that the corporation is responsible for everything. So I just wanted to make that very clear, is that the infrastructure in the community is really each community's responsibility.
It's the regional authority's responsibility to maintain it, but it will be assessed back under this plan within municipal boundaries. According to municipal boundaries, the collection system. So, I mean, and to be fair, I mean, Sarah's right. We don't have great information about everything that's underground. We could go out and study the entire system and figure it out. And none of you have that information. What we can tell you is all of you have systems that are pretty bad. The entire west side of Ansonia is the original Derby system that just dumped into the river when that was Derby. That system was built when Wakely Avenue was in Derby.
We just want a camera truck and they can do it.
No, I understand, but the point we're trying to make is that all of your systems are very old. The INI, the inflow and infiltration in all the systems is significant. It's not, but we decided not to address that and to recommend that it be assessed by town boundaries. Now, that's up to whatever regional authority you guys create, if you create one. You made a statement that we're advocates. We're not advocates. We're a study team. The city of Ansonia and the city of Derby asked us to look, starting in 2014, for a way to study consolidation of the two plants. We looked at the entire Naugatuck River watershed, whole Waterbury, where it's a brand new plant. So we looked at Naugatuck to Shelton. Shelton was out, and then we were left with those four towns to look at. We're here with the recommendations based on the best information we could find from any of you to tell you how a system could be set up and what the preferred alternative, the recommended alternative for doing so is. But we are not advocating this up here. We're telling you what the facts as we saw them are, as we interpreted them. And it's really up to the three towns to take this information, to sit down and decide whether it's worth pursuing between two or three.
Thank you.
Thank you. Questions? Someone else? Gentleman right here.
Also, I slide back, we saw that Ansonia needed to upgrade networks. I think there was one other one on there, but I'm not sure. Does that need to be upgraded only for regionalization? Because everything else that was set up Derby needs to be done regardless. Everything that's about Seymour needs to be done regardless. But right now, as it's only 6, we don't need it. We only need upgrades regional. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I remember that we're looking at a base case situation, which is not just exactly where you are at this point, but for a 20-year planning period. Okay, remember that, that's an important point. Now, having to answer your question a little bit more head on, yes, there's still some areas of your plan that need upgrade. One area specifically is the bottleneck that occurs at the tail end of the plant where the UV facility is. There is a bottleneck there, there is a restriction of flows, not every day, but when it gets high, it has been reported and reported that the restrictions at the tail end of the plant, particularly when flow comes in through the UV facility, is a restriction. And that's one that we identified as
That's one possible thing that needs to be upgraded.
that one there. The other area is at the influence screens. You only have one influence screen right now. Oh, you have two now? Okay, we're talking about the automatic. We should put in two. You should be putting in two automatics. And when we spoke with your staff, again, probably not today, but within the past year, you were getting solids even into your sludge processing area, and you've had to replace equipment there because of essentially screening material that was bypassing the facility. So that was kind of a proof point for us that, hey, you know, with an additional screen, looking at that pretty carefully. We did look at that pretty carefully with a prior plant manager, but that's another area that we would point to in the base case as having to replace. Now, having to replace or having to install.
So we handled those flows with that bottleneck issue, that flows with the floods. Our RX system, that was all approved by DEP when we did our upgrade. So again, none of this has to be done unless we do regionalization. Ansonia can just sit back and run the way they're running perfectly fine. We can absorb those costs as we're doing now without having to get involved.
Yeah, and so you can make that choice. And so you can make the choice to not
We're
join
doing
the
that
regional.
now. We're upgrading our.
It's very clear, you have that choice. You can do
Let's
this.
upgrade the pump station. The other thing I out there is, well, that was the big, I didn't like seeing that, because it made it sound like we needed this to be done now. Just true. That's the farthest from the truth. I'm out there and tell you that. That's the farthest from the truth. The second one I wanted to ask you guys about was, you said there would be a governing body. That's the board of directors. Would that be the new owner of this? Or is this looking to go private? You're looking to bring a private company in and take over? Is that how it goes?
Did you address that? The question was one of whether this is a consolidation that would be publicly owned and operated, or whether it's part of a scheme to go and privatize.
I'm just saying, does this have the plans to bring in a private company and run, or is this looking like it's going to be town?
So I just have to repeat the question for people. The question is whether this is being designed for private operation. Is that fair?
Yes.
Okay. Or whether it's something that's planned to be continued by the public.
This is fully public. We have no interest in recommending privatization of your WPCS.
That board of directors would be the governing body.
The board of directors would be appointed in the same way your board of directors is appointed now,
Okay.
except they would be appointed to the region.
So each town would be expanding their governing PCA, so that each town gives up the right to have input other than those three board members of our tax rates. That fair?
You would have three board members on my recommendation. Each community would have three board members.
The Ansonia Seymour would be losing a lot of say here. It'll only be those 9 people making decisions. That's a lot. We'd be losing a lot.
I think the question is, currently, each community has a board of directors, which is larger than, some number larger than 3, right? So you're looking at it as a loss of representation by going down to 3 members. Is that, and I
Yeah,
understand
you're going with a smaller board, with a larger group. We have smaller groups now with larger boards making decisions. I know in Ansonia, or the PCA, or Alderman, or Mayor, they've worked very hard to keep our rates extremely flat without moving. And I think we'd be giving up way too much to just 3 people decide what happens with our WPCA and our collections. And getting back to that collections deal, I don't think that's fair also that we take over the maintenance of it, but the monetary, it monetarily falls back on the citizens.
so. There's certainly, if the individual communities, you know, in the process of negotiating, they decide they want to go forward with regionalization, and they certainly are free to have a bigger board. You know, and go to 5 members. That, you know, that is really a political decision within the towns. We recommended 3 because 9 members is a manageable number. We believe that that's enough size of a board to run an organization of this size. We're not talking about it will be one of the smallest wastewater regions in southern New England. So we're not talking about a huge organization to run. But if at the end of the day, the communities decide they want to have 5 members for each town, I don't, you know, that's not to be said.
Also, Ansonia seems to be like they're going to take the front of this. So if we add flow card plan from 2 other towns, it's going to put a huge burden on our new equipment. A huge burden on everything. We rely on low flows at night to give our pumps a rest. Pumps to run water. We kind of rely on that whole overnight where we don't run for an hour or so. This extra flow out it, I can see it becoming a huge burden on our new plant that our taxpayers 13 years to pay for.
Right,
And I don't think that's fair to us.
can I just restate that?
Yeah.
All right, so the concern is that the plant wouldn't be able to handle the higher flows, given its.
It will be a bigger burden on our system. Our current system, that we can do it, but you can't. It will be a bigger burden on our system.
The combined flows would be a larger burden on the plant operations. Anybody want to feel that one?
I think your question is essentially a question of runtime. The example that you used with pumping was that right now, with the communities closed, with so many communities closed, your pumps at night can kind of take a rest. And while, you know, with all the other communities, the other 2 communities coming in, those, you know, the flows are not going to be as low as they are right now, so those pumps are going to operate more. And that's probably correct. But you know, you have to look at every system and really see whether they're really running optimally. I don't think it's an area, we recognize your question. I think it's a good question. Overall, does it really diminish the life of the equipment appreciably? We're not really sure that. We're probably, as a matter of fact, we're already thinking that those inflow pumps are going to have to become larger pumps to begin with. And that was factored into our cost because the influent pumps need to be bigger because you don't have a big flow.
You're going to have bigger well, effluent pumps, all needs to be upgraded. We can't handle flow now under big rains. It becomes a big issue. We handle it because we're good operators. So winter, too much, each town was giving up too much. And it was sad going to the regional system, that's how I feel.
Thank you, Mr. Seaman.
You got
Any other questions from the audience? Anyone else? Mr. Walsh?
I just have one.
Sure. I'll address Mr. Walsh's question had to do with how we factored in the availability of new infrastructure money from the federal government under the Clean Water Act and how we would account for that in any system like this. So there is more money in clean water, and there's an ongoing discussion in Connecticut with DEEP about how from the plus up of the federal funding would be allocated to clean water projects. There's a discussion as to whether they should be restricted to combined sewer overflow projects as opposed to sewage plant upgrades and like regionalization projects. We would be advocating that it's far from certain at this point. So we would be advocating for any federal infrastructure dollars that became available or might be awarded to this project would be spent on the top to pay for the connections between the collection systems and between the separate systems. So the current proposal, the current analysis shows $66 million in savings, assuming that the new system is going to pay for all of those improvements, dollar for dollar. We would probably be able to, take it's $55–60 million of connecting systems to put this regional system together. I checked that number. I knew you were going to ask this question. I checked that number before we started tonight. And but the goal would be to eliminate as much of that $58 million from the overall regional project by tapping into the infrastructure. So that's what we're also to be relatively better. Any other questions? If there are no further questions, there are no additional questions online. I really want to thank the consultant team that's worked on this. They've been great. They worked really hard. They're a great quality firm. The Black & Veatch is a great quality firm. The Collins Center does really good work in the state of Connecticut and the state of Massachusetts. Found them actually ran into them tax reduction study in the state of Connecticut. Hope to work with them again in the future. We will be publishing this study in the final copy that we together. It'll be on the website, on our website, NVCOG.gov. And at that point, it'll really be up to the towns to decide whether they want to pick up this process from here and move it forward. Form a committee, figure out how to negotiate this, put a valuation on the existing assets and see if there's a way forward.
Thank you guys for your work.
Thank you.